In this section, we will be discussing affinity rules. If we look at the definition for affinity, we can see it is a feeling of closeness. So you could say I have an affinity for chocolate. We are going to look at affinity rules, both virtual machine to virtual machine affinity rules and VM to host. VM to VM affinity rules keep certain virtual machines together or apart, and VM to host affinity rules place certain virtual machines on certain hosts. So let's start out with VM to VM affinity rules. One VM to VM affinity rule is where we want to keep certain virtual machines on the same ESXi host for the purposes of faster communication. And an example of that might be a web server and a database server or an application server. If they are on the same ESXi host, then they can communicate with each other faster than if they are on different ESXi hosts. And conversely, if we want to put certain virtual machines on different ESXi hosts, and this is called an anti-affinity rule, we might want to do this for the purposes of fault tolerance. The primary DNS server is on one ESXi host, and the secondary DNS server is on another ESXi host, and if either ESXi host crashes, that's okay. We have another DNS server on another ESXi host. Let's create an affinity rule, a VM to VM affinity rule. To do that, we go to the vSphere web client, and we go to our cluster and select the Manage tab. And under Settings, under VM to Host Rules, we currently see there are no VM to Host rules. So I click on Add, and I will give this rule a name. Since what I want to do is to keep the database and the web server on the same ESXi host, I will simply call this rule database and web server. I will enable the rule, and I will select the checkbox that allows me to keep the virtual machines together on the same ESXi host. Then I will add the virtual machines that I want to be on the same ESXi host. I will select the database server, and I will select the web server, followed by OK and OK. So now we can see we've created a rule whereby the database server and the web server will be kept on the same ESXi host. Now, conversely, we might want to have virtual machines on different ESXi hosts. That's an anti-affinity rule. To do so, let's click on Add, and then I will give this anti-affinity rule a name, and I will call it DNS servers, because I want to keep the DNS servers on different ESXi hosts. If I select the drop-down, I will select Separate the virtual machines, keep them on different ESXi hosts, and then I add the virtual machines that I want to be kept on different ESXi hosts, and I will select my primary and my secondary DNS servers. So now I have two sets of rules here, one to keep virtual machines on the same host and one to keep virtual machines on separate hosts. Now let's look at VM to host affinity rules. This is where we want to keep certain virtual machines on certain ESXi hosts, and the example would be we have a heavily used database server virtual machine, and we only want it to run on powerful ESXi hosts. To do this, we have to create DRS groups. So we will create two DRS groups. The first group will contain virtual machines that have high CPU requirements, and the second group will contain high-end ESXi hosts. And the rules will be that they should run together, or they should not run together, or they must run together, or they must not run together. we have something called a required versus a preferential rule. If we look at the VM to host affinity rules, we can see that they can be either required or preferential. If an affinity rule is required, that means the virtual machines will only run on a certain ESXi host, and they won't run on any others. Conversely, a preferential rule is where the system will try to load certain virtual machines on a specific ESXi host, but if that's not possible, then the virtual machines will be loaded on another ESXi host. Let's look at a little demo concerning preferential rules. So we have virtual machines to host affinity rules. So we have group A of virtual machines, and that is preferably run on blade chassis A. And we have group B of virtual machines, and preferentially, ideally, it's going to run on the ESXi host and blade chassis B. However, if the ESXi hosts crash for the blade and chassis A, then the virtual machines will be able to start up on another ESXi host. That is preferential. We would prefer it to be some way, a particular way, but if it can't be that way, then we can allow the virtual machines to run on another ESXi host. That's preferred. Now let's look at required. Required says these virtual machines must run on these ESXi hosts. And if these ESXi hosts go down, then the virtual machines are not going to start up on any ESXi host at all. That is called a required rule. So now let's create a virtual machine to host affinity rule using DRS groups. One group will contain heavily used virtual machines, and the other group will contain heavily used ESXi hosts. And then we will link the two together. So I will go to my cluster under Manage, under Settings, and where we see VM to host groups, I will click on Add, and I will create a first group, and I will call this group CPU Intensive Virtual Machines, and it will contain virtual machines. It's a VM group. Then I will add the virtual machines which tend to demand a lot of CPU utilization. In this case, it would be the database server and the web server. So that's one group, the group of virtual machines. And then the second group I will create will be a group of high CPU hosts. And of course, it's a host group, meaning it contains ESXi hosts. Then I will add the hosts which I know have a great deal of processing power, followed by OK and OK. So now I have two different groups. One group contains virtual machines which have a great CPU demand, and the other includes high utilization ESXi hosts. So then we go to the selection below that says VM to host rules. And then we will click on Add to create a new VM to host rule. And we will call this rule High CPU Virtual Machines and Hosts. We will enable the rule, and when we select the drop-down, we will select the rule that says Virtual Machines to Host. I select that. Then I specify the virtual machine group, which is CPU Intensive Virtual Machines, and then I can specify that they must run, or they should run, or must not run, or should not run on a certain host group. I will select the first example, must run on hosts, because I want these high CPU demanding virtual machines to run on the ESXi host with a lot of processing power. So I select the drop down and I select high CPU hosts. So that way CPU intensive virtual machines will only run on ESXi hosts which have a great deal of processing power. Then I click on OK, and now I can see that I have created my new virtual machine to ESXi host rule. Affinity rules. You have virtual machine to virtual machine and virtual machine to host. Virtual machine to virtual machine affinity rules can keep certain virtual machines together on the same host, and you would do that when you want to have fast communications between the virtual machines. The example would be an application server and a database server. Or you might want to have an anti-affinity rule where you keep virtual machines on different ESXi hosts, and that would be for the purpose of fault tolerance. You might have the primary DNS server on one ESXi host and the second DNS server on another ESXi host. And then virtual machine to host affinity rules place certain virtual machines on certain hosts. Common DRS problems. One common DRS problem is that the virtual machine does not receive enough CPU or memory resources. Well, one problem could be that the resource limit is too restrictive. In this example, the virtual machine, its parent pool or its resource pool ancestors might have a configured resource limit that is too restrictive. Check whether demand is equal to or greater than any other configured limits. Another problem might be a cluster overload. There might be simply too many virtual machines running on this cluster, and the cluster just does not have the processing power to support all the virtual machines. This would require a CPU or a memory upgrade, or both. Or it could be that the host is overloaded. And if one particular ESXi host is overloaded, you know what we can do. We can get a new blade for our blade server, and as you know, each blade contains 4 gig of RAM and 2 quad-core processors, and that would allow us to upgrade our ESXi host. For additional information, you can go to pubs.vmware.com, and you will see here is a section on creating a DRS cluster, load balancing, and power management, and then we have a section on using DRS affinity rules, such as VM to host affinity rules and VM to VM affinity rules. In summary, in this section we talked about load balancing across ESXi hosts. We did a review of vMotion, and we saw that DRS is simply automated vMotion. We then configured DRS for our cluster, and then we examined load distribution to determine whether or not it's a balanced or imbalanced cluster, and then lastly we configured affinity rules. And this concludes our section. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.